Welcome to Voice of Russia debate. I am Nikolai Gorshkov. Today we'll be debating what some observers hastily called Russia's poking the US in the eye in their own backyard. Well, this is how Western media summed up President Putin's tour of Latin America and especially his visit to Cuba about a month ago. Is it a rekindling of the old geopolitical game or a search for new business opportunities in a multipolar world? How consequential is the new Russian-Cuban alliance to world politics? To discuss this, I'm joined in the studio by Dr. Francisco Dominguez, head of Center for Brazilian and Latin American Studies at the Middlesex University. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
On Skype by Dr. Mervyn Bain, senior lecturer at the School of Social Science, University of Aberdeen. Hello, Dr. Bain.
Okay, hello. Pleased to meet you.
And on the line from Havana, no other than, we have Dmitry Prieto Samsonov, a Cuban journalist of Russian heritage writing for Havana Times. Hello, Mr.
Hello,
Samsonov.
everyone.
Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. And let me start with a brief overview of the visit. President Putin's visit to Cuba last July has taken a huge burden off Havana's shoulders, almost $32 billion of debt racked up by Cuba during its relationship with the Soviet Union. The remaining $3.2 billion Russia is planning to reinvest back into the Cuban economy. And some Russian companies like the old giant Rosneft, for example, have already been active in the Cuban energy sector. But what has really agitated the press was a hint that Russia may reopen its listening post at Lourdes, which used to be a huge Soviet eavesdropping operation targeting the United States. Russia and Cuba stirring up memories of their Cold War alliance, a warning to their old adversary, the United States. Moscow uses Cuba to annoy the US. Russia and Cuba partying like it's 1962, a reference to the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. These are some of the comments offered by quite a few observers, but are they well-founded? Dmitry Prieto Samsonov, in Cuba, do you sense a 1962 atmosphere of anti-US party?
No. I think we are in another historical time right now, and this world is multipolar. We don't have these two hegemonic superpowers like in 1962, and I think this epoch is quite different. I do not sense anything like that.
Of course, still a lot of observers would point to some parallels. If we remember actually the crisis itself, Khrushchev's missiles were in response to US nuclear missiles, Jupiters, in Turkey. And Russia abandoned Cuba as it tried to establish a partnership with the US when the Soviet Union unraveled. Instead, it got another Jupiter situation, we might say, with NATO encroaching on Russian borders from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Havana, for its turn, is still waiting for the US embargo to be lifted after almost 50 years. So, Dr. Dominguez, don't you think that these developments are what really pushing Havana and Moscow closer together?
To start with, it seems to me it's a bit ironic to talk about Cold War revival when the United States never stopped its Cold War attitude towards Cuba. It's maintained it for 50 years and so on. But it seems to me that anything you look around the world, any crisis of major proportions that's got to do with military or the threat of military complications, it's got to do with US foreign policy. And it seems to me that Latin America, which is growing, which is developing, which is becoming extremely independent and distancing itself almost totally from, or totally, I mean all the countries, from the US and orienting itself towards the East, particularly China, but not exclusively, is seeking to diversify the number of partners and traders and countries with which it has relations. And I will see Cuba's relations now with Russia, the Russian Federation, as part of that. Similarly, it seems to me there is a second dimension to this, is the US and the European Union are closing up every single possible avenue for the Russian Federation to be a normal country in the world, applying sanctions and so on. There is no reason for the Russians not to seek for partners who are willing to trade and negotiate with them and talk to them and be friends with them in Latin America, Cuba being one of them. One final point, which the media has made a great deal of. They are suggesting that Cuba is a sort of mechanism for the Russians to expand trade in Latin America. This is a complete lie. The Russian Federation does business with all the Latin American countries regardless. Just the Cuban one is being massively intensified, and I think it's very good for Cuba and definitely very good for Latin America.
And of course, we may remember that Raul Castro, the new president, so to speak, he's been very active in trying to reinvigorate Cuba's relations with a lot of countries, with Latin America, outside of the Western Hemisphere as well. Also trying to actually encourage the United States to rethink their 50 years old embargo. He had some successes, some setbacks. Dr. Mervyn Bain, does this speak of the convergence of Cuba's and Russian foreign policy? Because on the one hand, you may think of it in terms of the old Cold War competition. On the other hand, is it not just the sign of times that both countries are looking to widen and expand their foreign transactions?
Yes, absolutely. But I think that the Cold War rhetoric, it's easy to make, but it's not really applicable to the situation now, as has been said earlier as well. And it's certainly the changes that have taken place in both Havana and Moscow's foreign policy have led to this convergence of other foreign policy goals, similar outlooks. Again, it's has been suggested earlier as well. You see both sides backing each other in their issues with the United States being important as well. Obviously Russia criticizing the embargo, the US embargo that continues, but also Havana, and at the same time also backing Russia over its various situations now, particularly in the Ukraine, but also in Syria earlier as well. What I think is also important as well is that obviously Putin's visit in July has increased the public interest in the situation, certainly the Lourdes situation being important in that increase. Also, as well, you've had Raul Castro being to Moscow twice in recent years, and also Medvedev being to Havana twice. But really, the relationship's upturn really started in the mid-1990s and has really been this kind of continuation for the reasons you outlined in the question. So it's maybe been heightened, but really the relationship has been in a kind of healthy state or a robust state for a number of years as well. But just Putin's trip and the international attention which has gone in Lourdes has maybe increased this interest which is taking place at the time. But it's really this upturn that's been taking place for a number of years is really taking place with trade being important, but also both countries the relationship being beneficial to both countries in their particular situations with the United States as well being significant.
But shouldn't Cuba be wary of newly found Russian interest in its economy and the rest? We all remember that the Soviet Union provided billions of dollars worth of aid during the long alliance during the Cold War years. But when the Soviet Union unraveled in 1991, the aid dried up and Cuba plunged into a deep, deep economic crisis. And the word is that this bitter experience has not been forgotten in Havana and may contribute to Cuban reluctance to do anything more than just, pure business deals with the Russians. Dmitry Prieto-Samsonov, do you sense any bitterness, any resentment, any, old grievances towards Moscow in Cuba?
I do not sense anything like that, but we have the diaspora issue. The Russian as well as the Ukrainian, the post-Soviet diaspora in Cuba is the largest one of all the diasporas living here in the country. So I think this is a good opportunity for the diaspora to get its own institutions, because this diaspora is not visible like other ones, like the Arab one or the Jewish or even some diasporas of African descent. So this is, I think, a critical issue for the Cubans. Relating the links with Russia, this opening of the new relations with some Russian firms and the economic relations, etc. Russia is just one of the partners Cuba now have in the world. We have strong ties with Venezuela, with China, etc. So it is not in any way a return to the situation before 1991. I think the Russian opportunity is just another chance to diversify Cuban economic ties with other countries in the world.
Dr. Dominguez, is not Cuba becoming then a place for competition between Russia and China, as opposed to having been something in between the United States and the Soviet Union?
No, I don't think so. There are one dimension which is important from the economic point of view. The sanctions applied by the European Union, particularly in the agricultural front, is going to ruin, farmers in Europe to start with. But also it put the pressure on Russia to find food, to import. And then Putin announced publicly that he was going to get anything that the European Union did not provide, did not supply, from Latin America. So that's complete improvement. I don't see any competition. In fact, one of the consequences of the US and European policy on Russia recently on the question of sanctions, particularly out of the situation in the Ukraine, has been to more or less push very hard Russia into the arms of China. There have never been such excellent relations. They declare themselves, the two countries, that their relations were strategic. You know, the gas pipeline, armaments, weapons, trade, everything else, technology and so on. So I don't think that at all. After all, the Cuban economy is barely $71 billion GDP. So it's a very small economy. I don't think there is any competition at all in the sense also that there are things that China can provide much, much more than the Russians can. And there are things that the Russians cannot. And therefore, they are going to find a modus vivendi. And the final point I want to make in this is this. There is no country in the world with such experience from foreign policy like Cubans. So if there were to be any complications, which I doubt, as a result of this relationship or any possibility of competition, they will be able to sort it out so skillfully as they have done. After all, they have learned greatly as a result of the very irrational and Jurassic, I would call, U.S. foreign policy on Cuba.
Of course, the writing off of $32 billion of debt, Soviet-era debt, is a huge relief to Cuba. But does it not come with a cost, a price tag attached to it? The reopening of the Lourdes listening post, Dr. Bain.
That's obviously an interesting question. I mean, on a number of levels. I mean, as I suggested in my previous answer, that the relationship has been on a kind of constant upturn since the mid-1990s. The two areas that you see that have been real bones of contention, one was the debt, which is a real bone of contention, particularly, maybe in the early to mid-1990s. But there was an agreement signed in September 2005 over the debt. There's also another agreement signed more recently before Putin's final announcement in July as well, being important for that. So it's been kind of been dealt with over a number of years. And what's also very interesting about Lourdes as well is it's really the decision, or Moscow's decision, to close Lourdes in January 2002 is the one area where there has been kind of tension between the two countries since the mid-1990s. Fidel Castro, going back to an earlier point you made, has actually compared Moscow's decision to close Lourdes to the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, just being told that it was being closed. And what's very interesting as well is that decision by Putin, a lot of people in Russia were extremely unhappy with that decision at the time as well. And highly significantly, in 2008, in a speech, Putin talked about closing the Lourdes base along with the ones in Vietnam and elsewhere. And the quote being, what did they get from the United States was more bases. So really, it's also a kind of, or I would argue, it's a signal to the Russian population as well about kind of Russian prestige in the world, that this has been the one thing that they've probably regretted having done in the past. So it's a kind of a combination of other things being important, but it's just maybe kind of prestige of Russia being important as well. So I can understand why you made that link between the two, but I would say it's probably more of a kind of continuous thing with both the debt and the decision to reopen Lourdes, because the decision to close it 12 years ago was the one bone of contention between the two countries and was an unpopular decision with certain segments of Russian society. So it's kind of this kind of signal to, or I would argue the signal to kind of Russian society about Russian prestige in the world as well being important in that decision to reopen the base.
Of course, it has yet to be seen whether this is a really serious intention, because obviously there have been some denials as well as to the reopening of the base. But would you believe that this is just a symbolic gesture then? Is there any strategic advantages that, or is there any strategic threat to the United States with the reopening of the base? Dr. Go ahead, please.
You obviously see that, with most things with Cuba, again, as Dr. has kind of hinted at as well, there's always two sides to the same kind of coin. You'd see some people saying it is a relic from the past, that information technology in the United States has moved on dramatically. So really, what will they be able to gain from the reopening of the base? But on the other hand, you see the argument being made that it's easier simply because of the geographical location for this, rather than maybe using satellites and the technology in satellites as well. So it's probably, with most things, it's probably somewhere where near the middle. It's certainly got significance, as a suggestion, to the Russian population as well. But it will have some relevance, but maybe it won't have the relevance, again, going back to the previous point, of maybe during the Cold War period as well, just with the fact that technology and the movement of technologies having moved on.
The United States, for its part, have not lost interest in Cuba as well. There had been reports then that back in 2009, for example, the U.S. Agency for International Development sent young Latin Americans into Cuba in what was called hopes of ginning up rebellion. Dmitry Priyatov-Samsonov, do you remember those days? Was there any threat of a colored revolution in Havana, or with the influx of Latin American students from elsewhere into Cuba?
I don't think so. In fact, these groups were not that large. We are talking about several students, other people from Latin America. And in fact, I think the influence of such actions in the Cuban society is quite low. I think this is much more about making, international impact by putting this information open to the public. But the real influence of the subversive programs from the United States in Cuba is very, very low, very low. We do not sense the influence of this here in Cuba.
And what about the effects of this 50-year-old embargo? We hear that with opening up of Cuban economy to some private enterprise or cooperatives, restaurants and the rest, small-time enterprises, life is looking up in Cuba. Do you sense any positive changes? Are there any hopes for the young people who might have been thinking of, emigrating, actually getting a new life in Cuba?
Well, this is just two questions in one. Regarding the embargo, the blockade. This blockade is quite anachronic policy.
But is it really impacting on the new efforts within Cuba to reinvigorate its economy?
Yes, it does, and also the transportation by sea is affected by the embargo itself, and so I think it is a real threat to the development of the Cuban economic ties with the other countries in the world, and also to foreign investment in Cuba. It is not just propaganda, as some persons say. The economic impact of the embargo is quite important.
Dr. Francisco Dominguez, much has been made of that famous handshake between President Obama and Raul Castro in South Africa during the funeral of Nelson Mandela. And hopes were running high of the United States actually coming out of their, Cold War thinking and doing something about the embargo. Now, is it going to happen at all?
The trouble is this. I think he meant the handshake as a gesture of something more to come. But the complication is that Barack Obama doesn't seem to be in control of what happens. Certainly regarding foreign policy towards Latin America, and I'm sure that this is the case about other places. There are so many institutions, the National Endowment for Democracy, the National Democratic Institute, the International Republican Institute, the Office for Transition Initiatives, the CIA, and so on. One can spend a long time mentioning them. They all have huge budgets. They have huge political support behind them from the key two political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats. The foreign policy regarding Cuba is hostage to the extreme right-wing Cuban-American Republican extremists. And, nobody's been able to shake that. So, therefore, I think I'm quite prepared to give Barack Obama the benefit of the doubt that he means something different. And, in fact, he has been alleviating the policy, the restrictions on Cuba regarding sending remittances and few other things, traveling and so on, which was stopped under Bush. But for as long as he's not in control and for as long as the key strategic policy of the blockade and everything that goes with it, including all the legislation, the Helms-Burton bill and so on, then this is going to continue because these bodies underneath the presidency that operate pretty much autonomously will continue to do what they do. And in fact, if I may comment on this, these youngsters that you were mentioning in the previous question, Obama possibly didn't know that were being sent. And I'm sure that people at the level of the government, ministries or secretaries, did not know. Possibly somebody might know. But, it's a decision which is taken by freelancers, more or less, within the State Department. That is where the problem lies.
Dr. Mervyn Bain, in a way, Cuba, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, was living in a kind of a time warp, and the United States' interests in the country was appearing to be on the wane. Sometimes there were glitches or hints of renewed interest, but nothing really happened until the renewed interest from Russia and China to a certain degree. Will this newly rekindled relationship between Moscow and Cuba actually force Washington to think again and start doing something about it?
It may do. I guess The issue would be it's to what level the relationship between Moscow and Havana develops. Obviously, it's as we've all been suggesting, it's becoming more important, it's becoming more significant. But again, as been said earlier on, at the moment, the level of trade is still low. The political will for trade to increase is important, but it's still low at the moment. Therefore, you would imagine that what's going to be is that a lot of people in the United States are simply going to say, well, okay, there's all this kind of attention arising at this point, but how significant, how important really is the relationship at this time? So it might not really drive change as would be the case. You always see US interest in things to do with Russian-Cuban relations increasing at certain points. When there was talk about trying to gain oil, you start seeing all the environmental issues that are going to suddenly become a concern. When there was talk as well of perhaps trying to recommence the project to finish the Juragra nuclear power station, again, environmental issues start coming back. You start seeing, is there going to be a Caribbean Chernobyl? So at times there's always this attention focuses massively from the United States with the issue of Lourdes at the moment driving that. But if you then start looking under the underlying kind of issues within the relationship, it's probably not significant enough at the moment to really drive change as perhaps, as you suggested at the moment. Change does need to come to US-Cuban relations, but whether this would be the reason for the change is perhaps to be somewhat more questionable.
Dr. Dominguez, what Russia really can give Cuba that it can't get anywhere else?
It can give access to a great deal of technology, some specific technologies that Cuba does not have access to or is difficult to find because of the blockade. It can certainly give technology regarding the extraction of oil, which the Russians have a tremendous experience, and everybody knows there's a huge amount of deposit of oil around Cuba, which have been explored, but not much has been produced as a result of previous exploration. It can certainly help in terms of geopolitics, that is to say, resolutions at the level of the Security Council in the United Nations and so on. And it can be market for whatever the Cubans can export. And the Cubans can benefit as well from getting things that they cannot get and they don't produce themselves. The irrationality of the blockade forces the Cubans to buy a rice from China when they could get it from the United States in a couple of hours. And it takes much longer. So in that sense, the range of possibilities that the Russians can offer the Cubans is quite significant. It's not as significant as with other countries, say China, but it's certainly significant in that sense. And it seems to me that the signal that the Cubans are sending regarding Lourdes, if I can comment on that, is that it is the Cubans who want it. And I think what they want to say with that, I'm not privy to any information from the Cubans, but this is my sense of it, is they're going to say that, there are strategic relations that they want to cement. And this is one they have, which actually preserve the system that they have thanks to the Soviet Union in the past, and they want to reinvigorate that now. And it seems to me they want to say to the United States, look, we are going to take the sovereign decisions that we want to take, and we are going to have the friends we want to have, and we are going to benefit out of those relations which they always have, regardless of what you think. And the only one that have to change in this is you, United States, not us. Seems to me that is the sense of it.
But obviously it is up to Russia to decide whether it needs it at all.
Well, obviously the Russians need it because Cuba is quite loved among the Latin American countries now. The changes that have taken place in the last period are enormous. There is UNASUR, there is the Commonwealth of Latin American Caribbean Studies. There are all this architecture of new integration that is rising and is emerging in Latin America. And one of the first presidents of CELAC, the new institution that excludes deliberately the United States and Canada and includes 33 Latin American countries, something unprecedented, 20 years ago, had Cuba as their president, even though Cuba could not be a member of the Organization of American States, which was set up the United States. So therefore, in that sense, to be friends with Cuba today is to be friends with Venezuela, with Ecuador, with Bolivia, with Brazil, Argentina, and so on. And, the more you think about it, more countries are going to change. So it makes a lot of sense in that sense to have good relations overall. And Cuba can open plenty of doors in the region, even though their economic weight is small. Their political influence can be quite large.
If we go a couple of steps down from, high politics, international relations and everything, onto the personal level, Dmitry Prieto-Samsonov in Havana, young Cubans learned a lot from the Soviet Union. They went to study in Soviet cities and brought back a lot of knowledge and expertise. What are young Cubans these days aspiring to, and what are they expecting from the new relationship with Russia, so to speak?
Yes, you're right. I think they aspire to a new level of opportunities. Cuban people is very eager to acquire new knowledge and new skills. So for Cuban young people, I think it is a very good chance to increase their level of competitivity in the world, and it is also a chance to acquire new knowledge regarding high tech, and also to know new languages and to build new cultural contacts, because the Cuban people is also very interested in the culture of the former Soviet Union, because we have had this gap in our relations. In the 90s it was very difficult to get any cultural information from the Soviet Union, but many persons really love the culture of Russia, the culture of Ukraine. They remember the old movies, but this is not just nostalgia. This is about moving forward, about acquiring new knowledge and new taste regarding the present-day culture of Russia.
Thank you, Dmitry Prieto-Samsonov in Havana. And I think on this note, looking forward for the new Cuban generation aspiring to get new knowledge and new opportunities in life, we end this discussion on the outcome or results of Russian and Cuban foreign policy exchanges, especially President Putin's visit to Havana in July this year. With me discussing this topic were Dr. Francisco Dominguez, head of Center for Brazilian and Latin American Studies at the Middlesex University, Dr. Mervyn Bain, senior lecturer at the School of Social Science, University of Aberdeen, and Dmitry Prieto-Samsonov, a Cuban journalist of Russian heritage, writing for Havana Times.